Hello, welcome. I'm glad you're here. There's nothing you need to do now, nothing to follow, nothing to remember. You can let your eyes close whenever they would like to. Tonight, we're going to drift far out to sea and back in time to the age of sailing ships and pirates. Not the pirates of stories and films, not the buried treasure, the parrots, the jewels on the sand. Those make wonderful tales for the daytime. Tonight, instead, we'll spend some quiet time with the real, everyday life of a pirate. The long, slow days at sea, the simple food, the rules they lived by, the endless rolling water all around. Because the truth of pirate life, when you strip away the legend, was mostly very ordinary and rather calm, and that makes it a fine thing to fall asleep to. So settle into your pillow. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, just a little, and we'll begin, gently. Let's begin with a simple question. Who were these people? The great age of piracy lasted from roughly the year 1650 to about 1730. For those 80 years or so, on the wide waters of the Caribbean and beyond, thousands of sailors left their ordinary lives behind, and as the old phrase went on the account. They became pirates. Most of them did not begin as villains. They began as ordinary sailors, men worn down by the hard life aboard merchant ships and naval vessels. And that life was very hard indeed. The pay was poor, when it came at all. The captains could be cruel. The work was endless, the food was bad, and a sailor had almost no say in his own fate. So when the chance came to join a pirate crew, many took it, not always out of greed, often simply out of a longing for something better, for fairer treatment, for a share of what they earned, for a voice in their own lives. A pirate crew was a remarkable mixture of people. There were Englishmen and Irishmen and Welshmen. There were Scots and Dutchmen and Frenchmen and Swedes. And there were many sailors of African descent, some of them men who had escaped slavery and who found, aboard a pirate ship, something they could find almost nowhere else in that world. The chance to be treated as an equal, to sign the ship's articles, and to receive a full and equal share, the same as any other man aboard. This was not, for the most part, born of grand ideas about freedom. It was born of something simpler and more practical. A ship at sea needed every able pair of hands. It needed skilled, willing, loyal sailors, and it could not afford to care very much where they had come from. And so, out of that hard practicality, grew a little floating world that was, in its own rough way, more fair and more equal than almost anything on land. They were, in the end, ordinary people, tired people, hopeful people, looking for a better share of life, out on the open water. Now let's step aboard the ship itself. Picture a wooden sailing ship, somewhere on the wide Caribbean Sea. The sails are full and softly billowing. The timbers creak, gently and steadily, as the ship rolls with the swell. The water moves past the hull in a long, slow, endless hush. Here is the first surprise about pirate life. Most of it was not exciting at all. Most of it was waiting. For all the legends of battle and plunder, the truth is that a pirate spent the overwhelming majority of his days doing exactly what every other sailor did. The slow, repetitive, ordinary work of keeping a ship alive at sea. There were the sails to be tended, raised, lowered, trimmed, mended. There were the decks to be scrubbed. There were ropes, miles of rope, to be coiled and spliced and repaired. There was the constant patient work of the pumps, for a wooden ship always took on a little water, and it had to be worked out again, day after day. There was the slow turning of the ship's wheel, hour after hour, as the helmsman held the course, and between these tasks there was a great deal of waiting, waiting for wind, waiting for weather, waiting for the lookout high above to spot a distant sail on the horizon. Days could pass, many days, with nothing on the water but the ship and the sky and the sea in every direction, all the way to the edge of the world. The quarters below decks were cramped and close. There was little privacy and little comfort. A pirate slept where he could, often in a hammock slung between the beams, swaying with the motion of the ship, with the sound of the water just beyond the wooden hull, a few inches away. But there was also, in those long days, a kind of peace that's hard to find on land. The same wide horizon, the same steady wind, the same slow roll of the deck beneath your feet, the sun crossing the sky, the stars wheeling overhead at night, brighter and thicker than any city dweller ever sees, the same endless soothing sound of water against wood, hour after hour, day after day. There is something in that rhythm, the creak of the timbers, the wash of the waves, the soft snap of canvas in the wind, that can lull a person into a deep and easy calm. The sea has been rocking sailors to sleep for as long as there have been ships. Now here is the part of pirate life that surprises people the most. For all their lawless reputation, pirates lived by rules, careful ones, rules they wrote themselves and agreed to together. When a crew came together, they would draw up a set of written rules, called the Articles or the Pirate Code, and every man aboard would agree to them and put his name to them. These articles governed life on the ship, how disputes would be settled, how people were to behave, what was forbidden, and what would happen if a rule was broken. And remarkably, a pirate ship was often more democratic than the proper navy or the merchant ships these men had fled. The captain was not some untouchable ruler. The captain was elected, chosen by the votes of the crew, and if he led badly, he could be voted out again and replaced. The big decisions, whether to chase a particular ship, where to sail, how to divide what they had gathered, were settled by a vote. Every man aboard had a say. Every man had a voice. There was another important figure aboard, called the quartermaster. His job was to represent the crew, to look after their interests, to settle their disputes, and to make sure that everyone was treated fairly and equally. He made sure each man got his fair share of the food, and the drink, and the plunder, and the shares themselves were divided far more evenly than you might expect. The captain and the quartermaster received a somewhat larger portion, perhaps 2 shares each. The other officers received a little extra, but every ordinary crewman received a full share of his own. The gap between the highest and the lowest was small, nothing like the vast difference between an admiral and a common sailor in the navy. Some articles even contained a kind of insurance. If a man was injured in the course of his work, if he lost a limb, the articles might promise him a sum of money in compensation. A surprisingly humane arrangement, written by men the world considered outlaws. Of course, there were punishments too, for those who broke the code. Lesser offences might be met with a flogging. The most serious crimes could be punished by marooning, being left behind on some lonely spit of land, or worse. The rules were real, and they had teeth, but they were rules the crew had chosen and agreed to together, and that made all the difference. It's a gentle thing to consider that even among pirates, on the far edge of the lawful world, people came together and agreed on how to be fair to one another. They wrote it down, they signed their names, and they did their best to live by it. Let's think now about something simple and daily: the food. In the stories, pirates feast endlessly: fine wines, exotic fruits, groaning tables of plunder. The truth was far plainer. A pirate, most days, ate much the same as any other sailor: salted meat, dried biscuit, and whatever else could survive the long weeks at sea. The most famous food of all was hardtack, also called ship's biscuit. It was made of just flour, water, and a little salt, baked again and again until it was hard as a stone. It was not baked to be delicious. It was baked to last, to resist mold and damp and the long months in a ship's dark stores. Sailors would soak it in water, or in their drink, or in a stew, just to make it soft enough to eat. There was salted meat, beef or pork packed in barrels of salt to keep it from spoiling. There were dried beans and peas. There was cheese, when they had it. And there was whatever fresh food they could gather along the way: fruit and vegetables taken on at a friendly port, or fish caught from the side of the ship, or whatever a coastal raid happened to bring them. But fresh food never lasted long at sea. And so, on a long voyage, the meals became repetitive and plain, and sometimes the food spoiled before it could be eaten. Hunger was a familiar companion. So was monotony. To drink, there was water, though water kept in barrels grew stale and unpleasant quickly. So there was also beer and wine and rum, which kept far better, and which the crew shared out fairly, like everything else. There's a quiet, human picture in all this: a crew of tired men, far from any land, sharing out a plain and simple meal at the end of a long day's work, soaking a hard biscuit soft, passing the cup, eating together in the lamplight below decks, with the sea washing endlessly against the hull just outside, while the ship rocked them all gently in the dark. Let's drift now into the rhythm of time aboard the ship. For time, at sea, passed differently than it does on land. On a ship, the day and night were divided into stretches of duty called watches. The crew was split into groups, and each group took its turn: a few hours on duty, then a few hours of rest, around and around, through the whole turning of the day and night, so that at any hour, no matter how late, some of the crew were awake and at their stations, keeping the ship safe and on her course, while the others slept. The watches were marked by a bell. There were no clocks that a sailor carried in his pocket. Instead, time was kept by a simple glass of sand, turned over when it ran empty, and at each turning the bell was struck. One bell, then two, then three, counting out the slow passage of the hours. The soft, steady ring of that bell, drifting across the deck and out over the water, was the heartbeat of the ship. A sailor came to know exactly where he was in the day by the sound of it. Imagine standing the night watch. The rest of the crew is below, asleep. The deck is quiet and dark, lit only by the moon and the dim glow of a lantern. The sails are pale shapes above you against the stars. The ship moves on through the darkness, rising and falling, slow and steady, and there is almost nothing to do but watch and listen, and feel the great roll of the sea beneath your feet. The lookout sits high above, at the top of the mast, scanning the dark line where the sea meets the sky. The helmsman holds the wheel, feeling the pull of the water through the timbers, making small, patient corrections to keep her on her heading. And the rest of the watch move quietly about their tasks, or simply stand and wait and watch the night go by. It is a lonely sort of duty, the night watch, but there is a deep peace in it too. The whole world narrows down to the small wooden ship, and the few quiet souls awake upon it, and the enormous gentle dark of the sea and the sky all around. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The bell rings softly, marking the hours, and the ship sails on, carrying its sleeping crew safely through the night. And when your watch was over, you would go below and find your hammock and climb in, still swaying with the motion you'd felt on deck. And someone else would rise and take your place in the dark. And so it went, all night, every night. The ship never truly sleeping, but always, always holding its people gently as it crossed the sea. We've spoken of the long, quiet days. Let's spend a little time now with the gentle work that filled them, the small, patient tasks that kept a wooden ship alive upon the sea. A sailing ship was a living thing. In its way, it was made of wood and rope and canvas, and salt water worked away at all of it, every single day. And so there was always something to mend, something to tend, something to set right. None of it was hurried. Most of it was the slow, repetitive work of the hands, the kind of work that lets the mind go quiet and still. There was the rope. A ship carried miles of it, great thick cables and slender lines holding up the masts, working the sails, fastening everything in its place. And rope, under the strain of wind and sea, frayed and wore and broke. So a sailor spent long hours splicing it, weaving the strands back together with patient fingers, and coiling it neatly and whipping the ends so they would not unravel. It was slow, careful, soothing work, done over and over, year upon year. There were the sails, great sheets of heavy canvas. They were forever tearing in the wind and needing mending. A sailor would sit cross-legged on the deck with a needle and a palm of leather to push it through the stiff cloth, sewing the long seams slowly, stitch by patient stitch. It was much like the mending done beside a fire in a quiet cottage, only here the light was the wide sky, and the sound was the wash of the sea. There was the wood of the ship itself, always needing care. Seams between the planks were sealed with fibers and tar to keep the water out, a task called caulking, tapped slowly into place. The decks were scrubbed smooth with blocks of sandstone. Brass and iron were polished against the salt. And down in the hold, the pumps were worked, hour after hour, drawing out the water that always slowly found its way in. And there were the simple, human tasks of any group of people living close together. Clothes to be washed and dried in the sun and wind, meals to be prepared in the galley, small repairs to a man's few belongings, knives and tools to be sharpened and kept from rust. Some sailors had particular skills and were valued for them. The carpenter, who kept the very fabric of the ship sound, the sailmaker, the cooper, who tended the barrels that held all their food and water, the surgeon, such as he was. Each had his trade and went about it quietly, in the long hours between any excitement. And in the quiet moments, when the work was done, there was rest and there was simple company. A sailor might carve something small from a bit of wood or bone just to pass the time. Some played at cards or dice, some made music, a fiddle perhaps, or a simple tune sung low. Some sat together and told stories, the old stories sailors have always told, while the ship rocked gently and the light faded over the water. It was, in its way, a slow and rhythmic life. The same tasks, the same hands, the same patient care, day after day. And there is something restful in imagining it. The quiet industry of it, the steady usefulness, the soft and repetitive motion of work, done well, with no hurry, far out upon the sea. After the long weeks at sea, there came, at last, the welcome sight of land, a smudge on the horizon at first, then a low green line, then the shape of hills, and a harbour, and the masts of other ships. After weeks of nothing but water in every direction, the sight of land was a quiet joy. Solid ground, fresh food, fresh water, and a rest from the endless motion of the sea. There were certain harbours in those days that welcomed pirates, or at least asked few questions of them. Small ports and sheltered bays tucked along the coasts and among the islands of the Caribbean. Here a crew could put in and drop anchor and step ashore for a while. The first task was always to tend the ship herself. After months at sea, the hull below the waterline would grow thick with weeds and barnacles, which slowed the ship down. So the crew would bring her in close to a quiet beach and lean her over on her side, a task called careening, and scrape the hull clean and seal any leaks and set her right again for the next long voyage. It was hard work, but it was done on solid ground, in the warm sun, by the water's edge, and there were stores to replenish. Fresh water above all, barrels and barrels of it, carried up from some clear stream. Fresh fruit and vegetables and meat to break the long monotony of salted food and hard biscuit. After weeks of the same plain rations, fresh food was a simple pleasure almost beyond describing. For the crew themselves, a stay in port was a time of rest and ease and a little freedom. After the close quarters and the strict watches of life at sea, there was room to stretch out and walk on ground that did not move and sleep a full night through. There was time to repair their clothes and trade for the things they needed, and simply sit in the shade and feel the stillness of the land. Some of these pirate havens grew into lively places, full of sailors from many ships and many nations, all come ashore to rest and resupply. They were rough places often, but they were also places of a certain freedom, where a sailor could, for a little while, set down the hard work of the sea. And then when the ship was clean and sound again, and the barrels were full, and the crew was rested, the anchor would come up, and the sails would fill, and the ship would slip back out of the harbour toward the open water once more. The land would shrink behind them, back to a green line, back to a smudge, and then to nothing at all. And there would be only the ship, and the crew, and the wide and rolling sea again, stretching away on every side. There is a gentle rhythm in that too, the long voyage, and the welcome rest, and the setting out again, the going and the returning. The way a life finds its shape in the steady repeating of things. Out to sea, and home to harbour, and out to sea again, with the patient turning of the seasons. Of course, there were moments of danger. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. There were storms, great ones, that could toss a wooden ship like a leaf. There was disease, which spread easily in those cramped quarters, and which a ship's surgeon, if there even was one, could do little about. There were rival crews, and now and then there was the thing the stories are built on, the chase and the fight and the taking of another ship. But here is the truth that the legends leave out. Those moments were rare. The chase and the battle were the exception, not the rule. They were brief flashes in a life that was otherwise made up of long, slow, ordinary days, of waiting and working and watching the empty horizon. Some of the names from those days have echoed down the centuries. There was Blackbeard, Edward Teach, perhaps the most famous of them all, with his great dark beard and his fearsome reputation. His flagship was called the Queen Anne's Revenge, and it met its end in the shallow waters off the coast of North Carolina, where it sank and lay quietly on the sea floor for nearly 300 years. When divers finally found that wreck, in our own time, they did not find heaps of gold and jewels. They found the real things of pirate life, tools and weapons, and the ordinary belongings of ordinary men, cannon and anchors, and the small objects of daily living, resting in the sand, the quiet evidence of real people who really lived and worked upon the sea long ago. And that, in the end, is the gentlest truth of all about the pirates. Beneath the legends, beneath the flags and the treasure and the tall tales, they were simply people, people who worked and waited and ate their plain food and lived by their agreed-upon rules and slept in swaying hammocks to the sound of the sea. People looking, like all people, for a fair share and a bit of freedom and a place to belong. The great age of piracy faded in the end as the navies of the world grew stronger and the open spaces of the sea grew smaller. By around 1730, it had largely passed into history, and from there, slowly, it passed into legend. But tonight, we've set the legend aside, and we've spent our quiet hours with the real thing, the ship, the sea, the long, slow, peaceful days upon the water.